Story 5 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Phantom Toe. I'm not a superstitious man, far from it, but despite all my efforts to the contrary, I could not help thinking, directly I had taken a survey of my chamber, that I should never quit it without going through a strange adventure. There was something in its immense size, heaviness and gloom that seemed to annihilate at one blow all my resolute skepticism as regards supernatural visitations. It appeared to me totally impossible to go into that room and disbelieve in ghosts. The fact is, I had incautiously partaken at supper of that favourite Dutch dish, sauerkraut, and I suppose it had disagreed with me, and put strange fancies into my head. But this be as it may, I only know that after parting with my friend for the night, I gradually worked myself up into such a state of fidgetness that at last I wasn't sure whether I had become a ghost myself. Supposing, ruminated I, supposing the landlord himself should be a practical robber, and should have taken the lock and bolt from off this door for the purpose of entering here in the dead of night, abstracting all my property, and perhaps murdering me. I thought the dog had a very cutthroat air about him. Now, I had never had any such idea until that moment, for my host was a fat, all Dutchmen are fat, stupid-looking fellow, who I don't believe had sense enough to understand what a robbery or murder meant. But somehow or other, whenever we have anything really to annoy us, and certainly it was not pleasant to go to bed in a strange place without being able to fasten one's door, we are sure to aggravate it by myriads of chimeras of our own brain. So, on the present occasion, in the midst of 1,000 disagreeable reveries, some of the most wild absurdity, I jumped very gloomily into bed, having first put out my candle, for total darkness is far preferable to its flickering, ghostly light, which transformed rather than revealed objects, and soon fell asleep, perfectly tired out with my day's writing. How long I lay asleep I don't know, but I suddenly awoke from a disagreeable dream of cutthroats, ghosts, and long winding passages in a haunted inn. An indescribable feeling such as I never before experienced hung upon me. It seemed as if every nerve in my body had 100 spirits tickling it, and this was accompanied by so great a heat that inwardly, cursing mine's host sauerkraut and wondering how the Dutchman could endure such a poison, I was forced to sit up in bed to cool myself. The whole of the room was profoundly dark, excepting at one place, where the moonlight, falling through a crevice in the shutters, threw a straight line about an inch or so thick upon the floor, clear, sharp, and intensely brilliant against the darkness. I leave you to conceive my horror when, upon looking at this said line of light, I saw there a naked human toe, nothing more. For the first instant I thought the vision must be some effect of moonlight, then that I was only half awake and could not distinctly see. So I rubbed my eyes 2 or 3 times and looked again. Still there was the accursed thing, plain, distinct, immovable, marble-like in its fixedness and rigidity, but in everything else horribly human. I am not an easily frightened man. No one who has travelled so much and seen so much has been exposed to so many dangers as I can be, but there was something so mysterious and unusual in the appearance of this single toe, that for a short time I could not think what to be at, so I did nothing but stare at it in a state of utter bewilderment. At length, however, as the toe did not vanish under my steady gaze, I thought I might as well change my tactics, and remembering that all midnight invaders, be they thieves, ghosts, or devils, dislike nothing so much as a good noise, I shouted out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" The toe immediately disappeared in the darkness. Almost simultaneously with my words I leapt out of bed and rushed towards the place where I had beheld the strange appearance. The next instant I ran against something and felt an iron grip round my body. After this I have no distinct recollection of what occurred, excepting that a fearful struggle ensued between me and my unseen opponent; that every now and then we were violently hurled to the floor, from which we always rose again in an instant, locked in a deadly embrace; that we tugged and strained and pulled and pushed, I in the convulsive and frantic energy of a fight for life, he, for by this time I had discovered that the intruder was a human being, actuated by some passion of which I was ignorant; that we whirled round and round, cheek to cheek and arm to arm, in fierce contest, till the room appeared to whiz round us, and that at least a dozen people, my fellow traveller among them, roused, I suppose, by our repeated falls, came pouring into the room with lights and showed me struggling with a man having nothing on but a shirt, whose long tangled hair and wild, unsettled eyes told me he was insane. And then, for the first time, I became aware that I had received in the conflict several gashes from a knife, which my opponent still held in his hand. To conclude my story in a few words, for I dare say all of you by this time are getting very tired, it turned out that my midnight visitor was a madman who was being conveyed to a lunatic asylum at the Hague, and that he and his keeper had been obliged to stop at Delft on their way. The poor fellow had contrived during the night to escape from his keeper, who had carelessly forgotten to lock the door of his chamber, and with that irresistible desire to shed blood particular to so many insane people had possessed himself of a pocket knife belonging to the man who had charge of him, entered my room, which was most likely the only one in the house, unfastened, and was probably meditating the fatal stroke when I saw his toe in the moonlight, the rest of his body being hidden in the shade. After this terrible freak of his he was watched with much greater strictness, but I ought to observe, as some excuse for the keeper's negligence, that this was the first act of violence he had ever attempted. End of Story 5. Story 6 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Davenport's Ghost by Frederick P. Schrader. Dear readers, do you agree with Hamlet? Do you believe that there is more between heaven and earth than we dream of in our philosophy? Does it seem impossible to you that Eliphas Levi conjured up the shade of Apollonius of Tyana, the prophet of Magi, in a London hotel, and that the great sage, William Crookes, drank his tea at breakfast several days a week, for months in succession, in the society of the materialized spirit of a young lady, attired in white linen, with a feather turban on her head? Do not laugh. Panic would seize you in the presence even of a turbaned spirit, and the grotesque spectacle but would intensify your terror. As for me, I did not laugh last night on reading an account in the New York newspaper of a criminal trial that will probably terminate in the death penalty of the accused. It is a sad case. I shudder as I transcribe the records of the trial from the testimony of the hotel waiter, who heard the conversation of the two confederates through a keyhole, and of 40 thoroughly credible witnesses, who testify to the same facts. What would my feelings if I had seen the beautiful victim with the gaping wound in her breast, into which she dipped her finger to mark the brow of her murderer? About 3 o'clock in the afternoon of February 3rd, Professor Davenport and Miss Ida Southcott, a very pale and delicate young girl, who had submitted to the tests of Professor Davenport for a number of years, were finishing their dinner in their room in the second story of a New York hotel. Professor Benjamin Davenport was a celebrity, but it was said that he owed his fame to somewhat questionable means. The leading spiritualists did not repose the confidence in him that manifestly marked their regard for William Crookes or Daniel Douglas Home. Greedy and unscrupulous mediums, the author of Spiritualism in America thinks, are to blame for the most bitter attacks to which our cause has been exposed. When the materializations do not take place as quickly as circumstances require, they resort to trickery and fraud to extricate themselves from a dilemma. Professor Benjamin Davenport belonged to these versatile mediums. Aside from this, queer stories were afloat about him. He was secretly accused of highway robbery in South America, cheating at cards in the gambling houses of San Francisco, and the over-hasty use of firearms towards persons who had never offended him. It was said almost openly that the professor's wife had died from abuse and grief at his infidelity. But in spite of these annoying rumors, Mr. Davenport, by virtue of his skill as a fraud and faker, continued to exercise a great deal of influence upon certain plain and simple-minded folks, whom it was impossible to convince that they had not touched the materialized spirits of their brothers, mothers, or sisters through the agency of his wonderful power. His professional success received material ascension from his swarthy, Mephisto-like countenance, his deep, fiery eyes, his large curved nose, the cynical expression of his mouth, and the lofty, almost prophetic tone of his words. When the waiter had made his last visit, he did not go far. The following conversation took place in the room. "There is to be a séance this evening at the residence of Mrs. Harding," began the medium. "Quite a number of influential people will be there, and 2 or 3 millionaires. Conceal under your skirt the blonde woman's wig and the white material in which the spirits usually make their appearance." "Very well," replied Ida Southcott, in a resigned tone. The waiter heard her pace the room. After a pause, she asked, "Whose spirit are you going to control this evening, Benjamin?" The waiter heard a loud, brutal laugh and the chair groaning beneath the weight of the demonstrative professor. "Guess." "How should I know?" she asked. "I am going to conjure up the spirit of my dead wife." And another burst of laughter issued from the room, full of sinister levity. A cry of terror burst from Ida's lips. A muffled sound indicated to the eavesdropper at the door that she was dragging herself to the feet of the professor. "Benjamin, Benjamin, don't do it," she sobbed. "Why not? They say I broke Mrs. Davenport's heart. The story is damaging my reputation, but it will be forgotten if her spirit should address me in terms of endearment from the other shore in the presence of numerous witnesses. For you will speak to me tenderly, will you not, Ida?" "No, no, you shall not do it. You shall not think of it. Listen to me, for God's sake. During the 4 years that I have been with you, I have obeyed you faithfully and suffered patiently. I have lied and deceived like you. I learned to imitate the sleep and symptoms of clairvoyance. Tell me, did I ever refuse to serve you, or utter a word of complaint, even when my shoulders bent with the weight of my burden, when you pierced the flesh of my arms with knitting needles? Worse than all this, I imitated distant voices behind curtains, and made mothers and wives believe that their sons and husbands had come from a better world to communicate with them. How often have I performed the most dangerous feats in parlours, with the lamps turned low? Clothed in a shroud or white muslin, I essayed to represent supernatural forms, whom tear-dimmed eyes recognized as those of departed dear ones. You do not know what I suffered at this unhallowed work. You scoff at the mysteries of eternity. I suffer the torments of an impending retribution. My God! If some time the dead whom I counterfeit should rise up before me with uplifted arms and dreadful imprecations. This constant terror has injured my heart. It will kill me. I am consumed by fever. Look how emaciated, how worn out and downcast I am, but I am under your control. Do as you like with me. I am in your power, and I want it to be so. Have I ever complained? But do not force me to do this thing, Benjamin. Have pity on me for what I have done for you in the past, for what I am suffering. Do not attempt this mummery. Do not compel me to play the role of your dead wife, who was so tender and beautiful. Oh, what put that into your mind? Spare me, Benjamin, I implore you." The professor did not laugh again. Amid the confusion of upturned articles of furniture the eavesdropper distinguished the sound of a skull striking the floor. He concluded that Professor Davenport had knocked Miss Ida down with a blow of his fist, or kicked her as she approached him. But the waiter did not enter the room, as no one rang for him. That evening 40 persons were assembled in Miss Joanne Harding's parlor, staring at a curtain where the spirit form was in process of materializing. One dark lantern in a corner of the room contributed the light that emphasized the darkness rather than relieved it. The room was pervaded by profound silence, save the quickened, suppressed breathing of the spectators. The fire in the grate cast mysterious rays of light, resembling fugitive spirits, upon the objects around, almost indistinguishable in the semi-gloom. Professor Davenport was at his best this evening. The spirit world obeyed him without hesitation, like their lawful master. He was the mighty prince of souls. Hands that had no arms were seen picking flowers from the vases. The touch of an invisible spirit conjured sweet melodies from the keys of the piano. The furniture responded by intelligent rappings to the most unanticipated questions. The professor himself elevated his form in symbolical distortions from the floor to an altitude of 3 feet, indicated by Mrs. Harding, and remained suspended in the air for a quarter of an hour, holding live coals in his hands. But the most interesting, as well as the most conclusive test, was to be the materialization of the spirit of Mrs. Arabella Davenport, which the professor had promised at the beginning of the séance. "The hour is come," exclaimed the medium. And while the hearts of all throbbed with anxious suspense, and their eyes distended with painful expectancy of the promised materialization, Benjamin Davenport stood before the curtain. In the twilight the tall man with the dishevelled hair and demon look was really terrible and handsome. "Appear, Arabella," he exclaimed in a commanding voice, with gestures of the Nazarene at the sepulchre of Lazarus. Suddenly a cry burst from behind the curtain, a piercing, shuddering, horrible shriek, the shriek of an expiring soul. The spectators trembled. Mrs. Harding almost fainted. The medium himself appeared surprised. But Benjamin recovered his composure on seeing the curtain move and admit the spirit. The apparition was that of a young woman with long blonde tresses. She was beautiful and pale, clad in some light, whitish material. Her breast was bare, and on the left side appeared a bleeding wound, in which trembled a knife. The spectators rose and retreated, pushing their chairs to the wall. Those who chanced to look at the medium noticed that a deadly pallor had overspread his face, and that he was cowering and trembling. But the young woman, Mrs. Arabella, the real one, whom he so well remembered, she had come in response to his summons, and advanced in a direct line toward Benjamin, who in terror covered his eyes to shut out the ghastly sight, and with a cry fled behind the furniture. But she dipped the finger of her thin hand into the blood from her wound, and traced it across the brow of the unconscious medium, the while repeating in slow, monotonous tone that sounded like the echo of a wail, again and again, "You are my murderer! You are my murderer!" And while he was rolling and tossing in deadly terror on the floor, they turned up the lights. The spirit had vanished, but in the communicating room behind the curtain they found the body of poor Miss Ida Southcott with horribly distorted features. A physician who was present pronounced it a heart stroke. And that is the reason that Professor Benjamin Davenport appeared alone in a New York courtroom to answer to the charge of having murdered his wife 4 years ago in San Francisco. End of Story 6. Story 7 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Phantom Woman. He took an all-possessing, burning fancy to her from the first. She was neither young nor pretty, so far as he could see, but she was wrapped round with mystery. That was the key of it all. She was noticeable in spite of herself. Her face at the window, sunset after sunset, her eyes, gazing out mournfully through the dusty panes, hypnotized the lawyer. He saw her through the twilight, night after night, and he grew at length to wait through the days in a feverish waiting for dusk, and that one look at an unknown woman. She was always at the same window on the ground floor, sitting doing nothing. She looked beyond, so the infatuated solicitor fancied, at him. Once he even thought that he detected the ghost of a friendly smile on her lips. Their eyes always met with a mute desire to make acquaintance. This romance went on for a couple of months. Gilbert Dent assured himself that nothing in his life can possibly remain stationary, and he cudgelled his brain for a respectable manner of introducing himself to his idol. He had hardly arrived at this point when he received a shock. There came an evening when she was not at the window. Next morning he walked down Wood Lane on his way to the office. He always went by train, but he felt a strong disinclination to go through another day without a sight of her. His heart began to beat like a schoolgirl's as he drew near the house. If she should be at the window! He was almost disposed to take his courage in his hand and call on her, and yes, even tell her in quick bursts that she had mysteriously become all the world to him. He could see nothing ridiculous in this course. The possibility of her being married, or having family ties of any sort, had simply never occurred to him. However, she was not at the window. What was more, there was a sinister silence, a sort of breathlessness about the whole place. It was a very hot morning in late August. He looked a long time, but no face came, and no movement stirred in the house. He went his way, walking like a man who has been heavily knocked on the brow and sees stars still. That afternoon he left the office early, and in less than an hour stood at the gate again. The window was blank. He pushed the gate back, it hung on one hinge, and walked up the drive to the door. There were 5 steps leading up to it. At the foot he wheeled aside sharply to the window. He had a sick dread of looking through the small panes, why he could not have told. When at last he found courage to look, he saw there was a small round table set just under the window, a work table to all appearance. One of those things with lots of little compartments all round and a lid in the middle which shut over a well-like cavity for holding pieces of needlework. He remembered that his mother had one, 30 years before. Round the edge of the table was gripped a small, delicate hand. Gilbert Dent's eyes ran from this bloodless hand and slim wrist to a shoulder under a coarse stuff bodice, to a rather wasted throat, which was bare and flung back. So this was the end, before the beginning. He saw her. She was dead, twisted on the floor with a ghastly face turned up toward the ceiling, and stiff fingers caught in desperation round the work table. He stumbled away along the path and into the lane. For a long time he could not realize the horror of this thing. The influence of the decayed house hung over him. Nothing seemed real. It was quite dark when he moved away from the gate, and went in the direction of the nearest police station. That she was dead, this woman whose very name he did not know, although she influenced him so powerfully, he was certain. One look at the face would have told anyone that. That she was murdered he more than suspected. He had seen no blood about, there had been no mark on the long, bare throat, and yet the word rushed in his ears, murder. Later on he went back with the police officer. They broke into the house and entered the room. It was in utter darkness, of course, by now. Dent, his fingers trembling, struck a match. It flared round the walls and lighted them for a moment before he let it fall on the dusty floor. The policeman began to light his lantern and turned it stolidly on the window. He had no reason for delay. He was eager to get to the bottom of the business. His professional zeal was whetted. This promised to be a mystery with a spice in it. He turned the light full on the window. He gave a strange, choked cry, half of rage, half of apprehension. Then he went up to Gilbert Dent, who stood in the middle of the room with his hands before his eyes, and took his shoulder and shook it none too gently. "There ain't anybody," he said. Dent looked wildly at the window. The recess was empty except for the work table. The woman was gone. They searched the house. They minutely inspected the garden. Everything was normal. Everything told the same mournful tale of desertion, of death, of long empty years. But they found no woman nor trace of one. "This house," said the policeman, looking suspiciously into the lawyer's face, "has been empty for longer than I can remember. Nobody'll live in it. They do say something about foul play a good many years ago. I don't know about that. All I do know is that the landlord can't get it off his hands." It was doubtful if Gilbert Dent heard one word of what the man was saying. He was too stunned to do anything but creep home, when he was allowed to go, and let himself stealthily into his own house with a latch key. He was afraid even of himself. He did not go to bed that night. As for the mystery of the woman, the matter was allowed to drop. It ended officially. There was a shrug and a grin at the police station. The impression there was that the lawyer had been drinking, that the dead woman in the empty room was a gruesome freak of his tipsy brain. A week or so later Dent called on his brother Ned, the one near relation he had. Ned was a doctor. Perhaps he was a shade more matter-of-fact than Gilbert. At all events, when the latter told his story of the house and the woman, he attributed the affair solely to liver. "You are overworked." The elder brother looked at the younger's yellow face. "An experience of this nature is by no means uncommon. Haven't you heard of people having their pet spooks?" "But this was a real woman," he declared. Well, I was in love with her. I had made up my mind to marry her, if I could." Ned gave him a keen, swift glance. "We'll go to Brighton tomorrow," he said, with quiet decision. "As for your work, everything must be put aside. You've run completely down. You ought to have been taken in hand before." They went to Brighton, and it really seemed as if Ned was right, and that the woman at the window had been merely a nervous creation. It seemed so, that is, for nearly 3 weeks, and then the climax came. It was in the twilight. She had always been a part of it, that Gilbert Dent saw her again, the woman that he had found lying dead. They were walking, the two brothers, along the cliffs. The wind was blowing in their faces, the sea was booming beneath the cliff. Ned had just said it was about time they turned back to the hotel and had some dinner, when Gilbert with a cry leaped forward to the very edge of the flat grass path on which they were strolling. The movement was so sudden that his brother barely caught him in time. They struggled and swayed on the very edge of the cliff for a second. Gilbert, possessed by some sudden frenzy, seemed resolved to go over, but the other at last dragged him backward, and they rolled together on the close thick turf. At this point Gilbert opened his eyes and tried to get on his feet. "Better?" asked his brother cheerfully, holding out a helping hand. "Strange. The sea has that effect on some people. Didn't think you were one of them." "What effect?" "Vertigo, my dear fellow." "Ned," said the other solemnly, "I saw her. It's not worth your while to try to account for anything. I have been inclined to think that you were right, that she, the woman at the window, was a fancy, that I had fallen in love with a creation of my own brain. But I saw her again tonight." "You must have seen her yourself. She was within a couple of feet of you. Why did you not try and save her? It was nothing short of murder to let her go over like that. I did my best." "You certainly did, to kill us both," said Ned grimly. Gilbert gave him a wild look. After luncheon Ned persuaded him to rest, watched him fall asleep, and then went out. In the porch of the hotel he was met by a waiter on his return, who told him that Gilbert had left about a quarter of an hour after he had himself gone out. Directly he heard this he feared the worst. having, as is usual in such cases, a very hazy idea of what the worst might be. Of course he must follow without a moment's delay, but a reference to the timetable told him that there was not another train for an hour, and that was slow. It was already getting dusk when he arrived there. He felt certain that Gilbert would go there. He got to the end of the lane and walked up it slowly, examining every house. There would be no difficulty in recognizing the one he wanted. Gilbert had described it in detail more than once. He stood outside the loosely hanging gate at last, and stared through the darkness at the shabby stucco front and rank garden. He went down a flight of steps to the back door, and finding it unfastened, stepped into a stone passage. It was one of the problems of the place that he should have avoided the main entrance door with a half-admitted dread, and that, only half-admitting still, he was afraid to mount the long flight of stone stairs leading from the servants' quarters. However, he pulled himself together and went up to the room. It was quite dark inside. He heard something scuttle across the floor. He felt the grit and dust of years under his feet. He struck a match, just as Gilbert had done, and looked at first at the recess in which the window was built. The match flared round the room for a moment and gave him a flash picture of his surroundings. He saw the stripes of gaudy paper moving almost imperceptibly, like tentacles of some sea monster, from the wall. He saw a creature, it looked like a rat, scurry across the floor from the window to the great mantelpiece of hard white marble. If he had seen nothing more than this, he saw in detail all that first match had flashed at him. He saw his brother lying on the floor, a ghastly coincidence. His hand was caught round the edge of the work table as hers had been. The other hand was clenched across his breast. There was a look of great agony on his face. A dead face, of course. This was the end of the affair. He was lying dead by the window where the woman had sat every night at dusk and smiled at him. A second match went out. The brother of the dead man struck a third. He looked again closely. Then he staggered to his feet and gave a cry. It rang through the empty rooms and echoed without wearying down the long stone passages in the basement. Gilbert's head was thrown back, his chin peaking to the ceiling. On his throat were vivid marks. The doctor saw them distinctly. He saw the grip of small fingers, the distinct impression of a woman's little hand. The curious thing about the whole story, the most curious thing, perhaps, is that no other eye ever saw those murderous marks. So there was no scandal, no chase after the murderer, no undiscovered crime. They faded. When the doctor saw his brother again in the full light and in the presence of others, his throat was clear. And the post-mortem proved that death was due to natural causes. So the matter still stands, and will. But where the house and its overgrown garden stood runs a new road with neat red and white villas. Whatever secret it knew, if any, it kept discreetly. Ned Dent is morbid enough to go down the smart new road in the twilight sometimes and wonder. End of Story 7. Story 8 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sandy's Ghost. Accommodations for the night, stranger? Well, yes, I reckon we can fix a place for you. Have a chair and set you down. Thank you. Don't you find this rather a lonely place? No neighbors, no nothing that I can see. How came you to settle here, so far removed from other habitations? Well, perhaps it's best not to ask too many questions ter once. Beg your pardon? No offense was intended, I assure you, simply idle curiosity. Don't say another word, stranger, but come on in, we'll have a snack for supper. Polly, bring on some victuals. You're just in time. Polly at once obeyed. She was a typical Western girl, tall, lithe, graceful, and limpid-eyed. She was clear-skinned and high-spirited, too, and in this case ignorant through no fault of her own. John Barr's eyes scanned her intently, and a flush came to her cheeks. For the first time in her life she was unpleasantly conscious of her bare feet. It may have been this that made her stumble and spill some of the contents of an earthen bowl over the guest's knees as she placed it on the table. Her eyes flashed and a tear of anger twinkled on the lashes. She stopped, half meaning to apologize, but an oath from her father caused her to set the bowl down heavily and to hurry from the cabin. A moment later Barr saw a flutter of pink calico from behind a pile of rocks. Old Kit Robinson saw it too. "Don't wonder at your sayin' 'tain't right. She's a smart gal, and a good looker too, as should have been sent away from here to school ter be eddicated. She won't leave her no 'count dad. I oughter be shot for cussin' her, but I ain't what I useter be. Settin' here and keepin' guard makes me narvous." Barr's eyes asked the question his lips refused to speak. Supper eaten, the men went outside and sat with their chairs tilted back against the cabin. Something in the younger man's frank face had softened old Kit into a reminiscent mood and made him strangely inclined to gratify an idle curiosity. The soft evening wind sighed through the branches of the tall spruce pines, and the declining rays of the setting sun caused the shadow of the rude home to stretch out longer across the greensward. From its shelter where he sat, John Barr looked out on the grand ranges of the Rockies, and wondered where in their vastness he would find the man he sought, the finding of whom had brought him into this wild and unforsaken mining camp. "Stranger, I've take a likin' ter you. You've been a somethin' about you that reminds me of someone I know, and you look like an honest chap. Say, do you believe in ghosts?" He put the question very suddenly, and a look of disappointment crossed his face when Barr told him that he did not believe in spooks. "Wall, I've seen 'em." A thought connecting the pink calico with something in the past came to Barr's mind. "Can't you tell me about it?" he asked. "I'd like ter if you'll swar on yer derringer and never ter blab. Will you swar?" The solitary guest started to smile, but the smile faded at the thought of unshed tears in Polly's eyes. It might make it easier for her if he humored the old man. "I swear," he said, and he did. "Do you see yon old spruce at the turn of the trail in the cliff jes' above? Wall, that's the spot I'm a-watchin' and guardin' till the owner comes ter claim it. I'm quick ter burn powder and pretty sure shot. I know a man when I sees him, and I ain't easy fooled. Wall, ter begin with, I had a partner once, and he was a man, sure 'nuff. He was from the state of New York. I never axed him as ter how so fine a gent come ter diggin' and shovelin' in the Rockies, though ter myself I said thar was some good reason. He had light hair, and we called him Sandy, for short, and he was jes' erbout as gritty as sand. We was as unlike as any two fellers you ever saw. He was quiet like and steady, and I was sorter wild and reckless, and I liked mounting due most to well. Wall, when we had a little dust scraped together, we would divvy, and I took my share way down ter the station on the other side of the cliffs and sent her off ter the bank in Helena. But I allers left some hid whar the gal could find it. Old Sandy had a bank of his own that no one knew about, 'ceptin' himself, and every time we divided he'd carry part of it ter his hidin' place, and then give the rest ter me ter send to his boy, that he said was bein' educated in some college way up in Boston. He seemed ter think a heap of that boy. Arter a while my old woman gave out, and soon we laid her away on the hillside. It was hard, stranger." Old Kit's voice failed him for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure and continued. "But when old Sandy, my good old pard, give up I didn't care for nothin'. We buried him in style. All the boys from round the diggin's was thar, and many an eye was wet. We didn't have nary a preacher, but the gal she prayed at the grave. For the life of me I don't know where she larnt it. Reckon the old women must have told her. Next mornin' the gal showed me a letter that Sandy gave her just 'fore he died. It was ter his boy, and she was to give it to him if he ever come out this way, and she got it yet. That same evening after supper, feelin' kinder gloomish, and like there was somethin' in my throat I couldn't swaller, I took a stroll up the gulch. I went on out to the top of the ridge of the big rock, and got ter studyin' where I'd find another pard like Sandy. All ter once I felt a hand touch my shoulder kind of light once or twice. I jumped up, half 'spectin' it was Sandy, but it was only the gal. Well, I was all took back at fust, and then I got mad. "What air you doin' up here?" I axed, kinder tough. She had tears in her eyes as she looked up at me and said, "Pap, don't git mad. I was lonesome. I seed you comin' up this way, and I follered you, 'cause I wanted to tell you that Sandy said ter give his boy his pile when he comes." "Wall," says I, "you might have waited till I come back to the house." And then I sent her back. Arter she was gone, I sot ter studyin' whar in the world Sandy's pile was. I tried to think where he could have hid it, but it weren't no use. All ter once I noticed it was plumb dark, and these surroundings ain't a healthy place for a man to roam in arter nightfall, 'specially if he ain't got his shootin' irons on. I cut a pretty swift gait for the shack. Just as I come around the bend thar at the pine, I happened ter look up toward the cliff, and thar sot Sandy. Yes, sir, he was him sure as you're born. My feet felt heavy as lead, and I couldn't move from the spot. I tried ter holler, but it weren't no go. Finally I gave a sudden jerk, and made a step toward him, and as I did so he disappeared. Then I made tracks for home, but I kept mum, because I knowed the boys would say that Mounting Dew was lickin' up my brains, and I would be seein' snakes and sich things 'fore long. The next night, somehow or 'nother, I thought ter go and see if he was thar again, and sure enough, thar he sot, lookin' kinder sad and makin' marks on the rocks with his fingers. I had my hand on my gun this time, so I got a little closter than afore. But by hooky, he got away from me again, nor did he come back. I could hardly wait for the next night ter come around. At the same time I was on hand good and early, just as it begun ter get dark, and the trees looked like long spooks a-stretchin' out their arms. I looked toward the cliff, and there he sot, markin' and scratchin' on the rock with his fingers and lookin' sad. Now, this being the third time, I kinder got bolder, and I went a little closer and says, "Sandy, what's the matter with you? Didn't the boys do the plantin' right for you?" Then as luck would have it, I thought of somethin' else right quick, and I said, "Or is it the dust you've hid whar you're sittin'?" Wall, he looked up at me then, and the happiest smile come ter his face, and all ter once he disappeared again. And since then I've sot here guardin' the place till the right one comes along ter claim it. Let's see, what did you say your name was? Pardon me, I thought I told you. My name is John Willett Barr. Polly, oh Polly, come you here, gal. What was Sandy's full name? I plumb forgot. What do you want ter know fur? She asked. I ain't goin' ter tell you now. That's my own secret. Come, gal. Tell me ter once or it won't be healthy fer you. Wall then, she answered stubbornly, it was John Willett Barr. At her reply the young man's face grew deathly pale, and he started up from his chair, but Kit thrust him back into his seat, saying, "Bring me the letter, Polly." "What are you going to do with it, Pa?" she inquired cautiously. "I promised old Sandy on my oath ter keep it till the right one comes along ter claim it, and I mean ter keep my word. The right one is here, gal. Thar he sits. So trot that letter out, and don't parley long with me if you knows when you're well off." Polly stared at the young man in utter bewilderment for a moment. Then, turning slowly, she stepped quietly into the cabin after the precious document. An unusual gleam of joy lighted up her face, and a suppressed excitement shone in her eyes. Under her breath she said, "Somehow or other, I felt he was the right one." Too truly, John Barr realized in that painful moment that whom he sought was now dead to him. That the father from whom he had been parted so many years was sleeping that long, dreamless sleep in the clay mound on the hillside, which marked his last resting place. As he turned to look at the face of old honest Kit, who had been his father's friend during those long years of forced exile, a happy smile lit up the old miner's rugged features as he pointed with his finger to the rock cliff near the old spruce vine, and said in an exultant, trembling voice, "Thar he be, stranger, just as I have seen him many a night, your dad, my pard, poor old Sandy." With an eager voice John Barr sprang forward, and the mountains echoed and re-echoed the plaintive cry of "Father! Father!" But his outstretched arms clasped only emptiness and the darkening shadows of the rapidly approaching night. End of Story 8. Story 9 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghosts of Red Creek by S.T. To the northward of Mississippi City and its neighbor, Hansborough, there extends a tract of pine forest for miles, with but few habitations scattered through it. Black and Red Creeks, with their numerous branches, drain this region into the Pascagoula River to the eastward, with the swamps of Pascagoula as a refuge, and the luxuriant and unfrequented bottoms of Red and Black Creeks to browse upon. There are few choicer spots for deer. Knowing this fact, a small party of gentlemen on the day before a crisp, cold Christmas started from Hansborough in a large four-wheeled wagon for a 30-mile drive into this wilderness of pine and a week's sport after the deer. The guide was Jim Carruthers, a true woodsman, and the driver a general factotum, a jolly negro named Jack Lyons, than whom no one could make a better hoe cake and cook a venison steak. His laugh could be heard a quarter of a mile, and his good nature was as expansive as the range of the laughter. The usual experiences of a hunting camp were heartily enjoyed during the first days of this life out of doors, but his cream did not rise until about the fifth night, when, from familiar intercourse, Jack Lyons became loquacious, and after the day's 20 or 25-mile walk, would spin yarns in front of the campfire, which brought forgetfulness of fatigue. The night before New Year's was intensely cold. The cold north wind of the afternoon had subsided at sunset, and only a gust now and again touched the musical leaves of the pines, making them vibrant with that mournful score of nature's operas which even maestros have failed to catch. In front of two new and white tents, two sportsmen reclined at length within reach of the warmth of the fire, while opposite them rested at ease the guide and the worthy Jack Lyons. Wearied with the day's chase, four staunch hounds, Ringwood, Rose, Jet, and Boxer, were dreaming of future quarry. The firelight brought out in bright relief the trunks of the tall pines like cathedral columns, and sparkling through the leafy dome overhead the scintillating stars glistened with diamond brightness. A silence which added its influence to the scene rested about the borders of the creek below, and gave more effect to the story of the veteran teamster than perhaps it otherwise would have had. "If de deer run down de creek," said old Jack, smacking his lips over a carefully prepared brewing of the real Campbellton punch, "we's bound to see fun tomorrer, for it'll take us down thar by de old Gibbet's place. In daylight there's no place like it, but after nightfall, you bet you wouldn't catch this nigger thah." Old Jack was naturally asked why he didn't care about visiting the Gibbet place that night. Asking to be excused till he filled his pipe, the silence was unbroken till his return. He piled on more pine knots and commenced. "You know, gemmen, dat when de gunboats was in de South, we folks had to travel way back hyah on dese roads out in de range of deir big guns. I was gauged by Mr. Harrison in haulin' salt from de factory at Mississippi City, and on der beach ober Mobile, and I had been makin' a trip every week or so. Dis back country road was neber thought of by de Federals, and we had good times 'long de way, no shells and no shootin'. De night, gentlemen, I's speakin' of was a Friday, dat yo's all know it's unlucky. Well, you see, I hitched up Betsy and Rose in the lead, and old Fox and Blossom at the pole, and takes the biggest load of salt that the team ever carried. I starts out and crosses the Biloxi River and Hansborough just as the moon was going down. Yes, boss, dese roads weren't no better den than now, and the rain made 'em mighty rough when yer come to the holes. I sat in the seat whistlin', de crows is in de pea patch, and a-thinkin' of Sarah Jameson, what was afterwards my wife, when I felt the off forewheel go croosh in a hole up to de hub. I'd made 17 miles out abo Hansborough. I did some cussin', and den went to the fence, about 20 yards off, and took out a rail to prise up the wheel. Den I saw I was at Mr. Gibbett's place. I says to myself, I'll go up to the house and get old Mr. Gibbett to give me a turn. I had gone by thar 2 weeks before and seed the old man. Now, gentlemen, yer listen to me, for what I's tellin' yer is as sure as Jimmy'll blow the horn on the last day. I walked up to the house, and there I saw a bright light inside. It showed out fro' the windows, and I saw shaders of Miss Gibbett and Mrs. Gibbett on the window curtain. Sure, honey, sure. The front door was shut, and I steps up ter the gallery and knocks with the butt end of my whip. I didn't knock loud, neither. God bless us all, gentlemen, the lights went out like dat, and I hears up a laugh, ha, 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 how that set my knees a-shakin'. I opens the door, and there was no sign of anybody. I struck a match, and all the furniture was moved out, and the old red cuttins that I thought I seed was in rags. The whole family was gone for sure. I didn't know exactly what to think about them strange voices, but I started back to the wagon when it lightened, and bress God, there in the front yard was 6 graves just made. Somethin' wrong here, said I, and I builds a fire by the wagon and digs the wheel out. Just den old Squire Pasture came along the road from Mobile, and he tells me the news. Old man Gibbett cut the throats of his wife and 4 children and shoots hisself in the head out in jealousy of his wife. They was all buried in the front yard, and the house was deserted 10 days before. Gentlemen, when I hear dat, dem miles make the quickest time to Mobile eber seed. And yous can tell me dar's no ghosts, but you don't catch me round dat log house of Gibbett's, 'ceptin' sun's an hour high. Jack looked suspiciously over his shoulder into the darkness and crawled into his blanket, muttering, It scares dis nigger even now to tell about that night. Sleep soon fell upon the camp, but the impression of old Jack's story survived the night, and the next day he still asserted its truth. End of Story 9. Story 10 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How He Caught the Ghost. Yes, the house is a good one, said the agent. It is in a good neighborhood, and you're getting it at almost nothing, but I think it right to tell you all about it. You are orphans, you say, and with a mother dependent on you. That makes it all the more necessary that you should know. The fact is, the house is said to be haunted. The agent could not help smiling as he said it, and he was relieved to see an answering smile on the 2 faces before him. Ah, you don't believe in ghosts, he went on, nor do I, for that matter, but somehow the reputation of the house keeps me from having a tenant long at a time. The place ought to rent for twice as much as it does. If we succeed in driving out the ghost, you will not raise the rent? Asked the boy, with a merry twinkle in his eye. Well, no, not this year, at any rate, laughed the agent. And so the house was rented, and the slip of a girl and the tall lad, her brother, went their way. Within a week the family had moved into the house, and were delighted with it. It was large and cool, with wide halls and fine stairways, and with more room than they needed. But that did not matter in the least, for they had always been cramped in small houses, suffering many discomforts, and they never could have afforded such a place as this if it had not been haunted. "Blessings on the ghost!" cried Margaret gaily, as she ran about as merry as a child. "Who would be without a ghost in the house when it brings one like this?" "And it is so near your school," said the mother, "and I used to worry so over the long walk, and David can come home to lunch now, and you don't know what a pleasure that will be. It seems to me," David gravely explained, "that if I should meet the ghost I would treat him with the greatest politeness and encourage him to stay. We shall not miss the room he takes, shall we? I think it would be very well to set aside that room over yours, Maggie, for his ghostship's own, for we shall not need that, you know. Besides, the door doesn't shut and he can go in and out without breaking the lock." And then they all laughed and had a great deal of fun over the ghost, which was a great joke to them. They were very tired that night and slept soundly all night long. When they met the next morning, there was more laughter about the ghost, which was shy about meeting strangers, probably, and had made no effort to introduce himself. For the next 3 days they were all hard at work, trying to bring chaos into something like order. And then it was time for the school to open, and Margaret was to begin teaching, and David inserted an advertisement in the city papers for a maid of all work, who might help their mother in their absence. For one whole day prospective colored servants presented themselves and announced, "Is dis the house dey wants a work lady? No, ma'am, I ain't goin' to work in dis house. Ketch me workin' in no haunted house." After which they each and all departed, and others came in their stead. One was secured after a while, but no sooner had she talked across the fence with a neighbor's servant than she too departed. "Never mind, children," said Mrs. Craig wearily. "I would much rather do the work than be troubled in this way." So the maid of all work was dismissed, and the Craig family locked the doors and went to their rooms, worn out with the day's anxieties. They had been in the house 4 days, and there had been neither sight nor sound of the ghost. The very mention of it was enough to start them all to laughing, for they were thoroughly practical people, with a fondness for inquiring into anything that seemed mysterious to them and for understanding it thoroughly before they let it go. David was soon sleeping the sound sleep of healthy boyhood, and all was silent in the house, when Margaret stole softly into his room and laid her hand on his arm. He was not easy to waken, and several minutes had passed before he sat up in bed with an articulate murmur of surprise. "Hush," said Margaret in a whisper, with her hand on his lips. "I want you to come into my room and listen to a sound that I've been hearing for some time." "Doors creaking," suggested David as he began to dress. "Nothing of the kind," was all she said. They walked up the stairway and along the upper hall to the door of the unused room. Something was wrong with the lock, and the door would not stay fastened, as I have said. Something that was not fear thrilled their hearts as they pushed the door further ajar, and stood where they could see every foot of the vacant floor. One of their own boxes stood in the middle of the room, but aside from that, nothing was to be seen, and they looked at one another in silence. "Hold the lamp a minute, Maggie," David said at last, and then he went all over the room, and looked more particularly at its emptiness, and even felt the walls. "Secret panels, you know," he said with a smile, but it was a very puzzled smile indeed. "I can't see what it could have been," Margaret said, as they went down the stairs. "No, I can't see either, but I'm going to see," said David. "That was a chain, and chains don't drag around by themselves, you know. A ghost could not drag a chain if he were to try." "The conventional ghost very often drags chains," said Margaret, as she closed the door of her room. And then she lay awake all night and listened for the conventional ghost that dragged a chain, but it seemed that the weight of the chain must have worried him, for he was not heard again. The mother had slept through it all, and next morning they gave her a vivid account of the night's adventure. Perhaps it was someone in the house, she said in alarm. But there were no ghosts within the bounds of possibility, so far as she was concerned, but burglars were very possible indeed. Then Margaret and David both laughed more than ever. "What fun would it be," said David, "for a burglar to get into this house and try to find something worth carrying away?" So they went on to the next night, all three fully determined to spend the night in listening for the ghost, and running him to earth if possible. But it was Margaret that heard the ghost, after all. She had been sleeping and was suddenly startled wide awake, and there, overhead, was the sound of the chain dragging. And just as she was on the point of springing out of bed to call her brother, the chain seemed to go out of the upper room. She lay still and listened, and in a moment she heard it again. It was coming down the stairs. There was no carpet on the stairs, and she could hear the chain drop from step to step, until it had come down the whole way. There it was, almost at the door of her room, and something that was strangely like fear kept her lying still, listening in horrified silence. Then it went along the hall, dragging close to the door, and then further away, and back and forth for a while, and then it began dragging back up the stairs again. Step by step she could hear it drawn over the edge of every step, and by the time it had reached the top, she remembered herself and called David. Again did the brother and sister make a tour of the upper room with the lamp. Not only that, but they looked into every nook and corner of the upper part of the house, and at last came back baffled. They had seen nothing extraordinary, and they had not heard a sound. "I'm going to see that ghost tonight," David said to his sister the next evening. "How?" "I'm going to sit up all night at the head of the stairs. Don't say anything about it to Mother. It might make her uneasy." So after the household were all quiet, David slipped into his place at the head of the stairs, and sat down to his vigil. He had placed a screen at the head of the stairway so that it hid him from view, as if a ghost cared for a screen, and he established himself behind it, and prepared to be as patient as he could. It seemed to him that hours so long had never been devised as those the town clocks told off that night. He bore it until midnight moderately well, because he argued with himself, if there were any ghosts about they would surely walk then. But they were not in a humour for walking, and still the hours rolled on without any developments. He took the fidgets, and had nervous twitches all over him, and at last he could endure it no longer, and had leaned his head back against the wall and was going blissfully to sleep when he heard a chain dragging just beyond the open door of that unused room. In spite of himself a shiver ran down his back. There was no mistaking it. It was a real chain, if he had ever heard one. More than that, it had left the room, and was coming straight towards the stairs. The hall was dark, and it was impossible for him to see anything, although he strained his eyes in the direction of the sound. And even while he looked, it had passed behind the screen, and was going down the stairs, dropping from step to step with a clank. Halfway down, a narrow strip of moonlight from a stair window lay directly across the steps. Whatever the thing was, it must pass through that patch of light, and David leaned forward and watched. Down it went from step to step, and presently it slipped through the light, and was down. And a little later it came back again, through the light, and up the stairs, and back into that unused room. And then David slapped his knees jubilantly, and ran down to his room, and slept all the rest of the night. Next morning he was very mysterious about his discoveries of the night before. "Oh, yes, I saw the ghost," he said to Maggie. "There, don't ask so many questions. I'll tell you more about it tomorrow, maybe." And that was all the information she could get from him. It was very provoking. That day David made a purchase downtown and brought home a bulky bundle, which he hid in his own room and would not let his sister even peep at it. "I'm going to try to catch the ghost tonight," he said, "and you know how it is. If I brag too much beforehand, I shall be sure to fail." He was working with something in the hall after the others had retired, but he did not sit up this time. He went to bed, and Margaret listened at his door and found that he was soon asleep. But away in the night they were all awakened by a squealing that brought them all into the hall in a great hurry, and there, at the head of the stairs, they found a huge rat trap that David had set a few hours before, and in the midst of the toils was a rat. "Why, David," exclaimed the mother, "I didn't know that there was a rat in the house." And then, all at once, she saw that there was a long chain hanging from a little iron collar round the creature's neck, and she and Margaret cried together. And this was the ghost! Such a funny ghost when they came to think of it, this poor rat, with a nest in some hole of the broken chimney. He had been someone's pet once, perhaps. And now, the households he had broken up, the nights he had disturbed, the wild sensations he had created, it made his captors laugh to think that this innocent creature had been the cause of the whole trouble. "I'll get a cage for him and take care of him for the rest of his life," said David. "We owe him so much that we can't afford to be ungrateful." The next morning he took the ghost in a cage and showed it to the agent, and gave him a vivid account of the capture. "So you have a good house for about half the price, all on account of that rat!" exclaimed the agent, grimly. "Young man, but never mind, you deserve it. What are you working for now? $6 a week? If you ever want to change your place, suppose you come around here. I think you need a business that will give you a chance to grow." And the agent and David shook hands warmly over the cage of the ghost. End of Story 10.